Most of us are familiar with MatPat's game theory video on For Honor. It was a video released before For Honor that gave a brief history of the Knights, Vikings, and Samurai that was meant to help explain who they were and who would win in a fight to the death. Now, the video was panned widely for being historically inaccurate and incredibly biased to the samurai side. And I wasn't going to talk about the video because it's very old now and it was already picked apart by historical YouTubers like Shadiversity, Skullgrim, and Metatron. There's no need for me to add to their work. But then I was pointed to another For Honor video from a channel called Lockstin Gnoggin. This video did pretty much the same thing as MatPat's video, but they were doing a few things differently, such as bringing in a supposed medieval historian to help discuss the heroes, and they weren't limiting their analysis to the 11th century like MatPat did, but will be looking at the heroes in their prime, how they appear in For Honor. Both of these ideas sounded great to me, so I decided to give the video a watch. And after watching it, did it turn out to be accurate? Was it good?
You know what's cool? Knights, samurais, and Vikings. This is why For Honor has been at the attention of a lot of prospective gamers. And so many all around the internet have been asking this very important question. If we look at these three warriors with the lens of truth and historical accuracy, who would truly come out on top? This is our take on it. And just to clarify everything, this video was produced mostly before the game theorists posted their video on the same subject. But luckily, MatPat, whom I'm often accused of hating, and I don't, came to a different conclusion than I did. Originally, this video wasn't a game theory debunked video, which I haven't done in almost 3 years. There's this weird stigma online that I love doing them. But due to the circumstances at hand, this video inadvertently has partially become that. Most of this video was made before his video was posted, and the bits that I have recently added to this video further explain why his video is entirely wrong. Now then, on with the original video. Oh, and by the way, I brought my friend and historic battle expert, Dr. Wiley, to help out with this.
Hello! So to break down these warriors' abilities, we need to look at their weapons, armor, and training, and all with historical context in mind.
But not only historical context, but also based on what is available in For Honor. For example, samurai in the real world later on had guns, but none in For Honor seem to, unless there is some DLC at some point, but that would be broken. In the game, Ubisoft made every faction and class as balanced as they wanted to, meaning they had to take some, creative liberty with the laws of physics. Like, geez man, how do Vikings survive a stab in the chest with no armor? Meanwhile, how come the Knight's armor doesn't seem to block anything? The answer, obviously, is game balancing, game mechanics. If one class or one faction was significantly better than the other, then everyone would play them. But looking at history now, what do we got?
Historically speaking, each faction comes from a different time period. Vikings existed from the late 8th century to the early 11th, while these particular knights, judging based on their armor and weapons, are from the late 14th to early 15th century. And the samurai is your classic 11th century samurai, which was used all the way up until the 16th century, because Japan doesn't like to change much, mainly because they didn't need to.
I don't know where that idea came from. Japan's armor absolutely evolved over time. The armor they used changed as technology and ways of war changed, especially when firearms were introduced in the mid-16th century, which meant that armor had to be made to accommodate it. But even taking that aside, the style of armor we see the Kensei wearing here looks like Edo period armor, which was developed around the 17th to 19th century. The last time we'd see samurai armor in use on the battlefield was in 1877, by the way. Armor absolutely did evolve in Japan. The most common forms of armor were from lamellar and lacquered leather armor to plate and scaled armor, all again lacquered. And after gunpowder was introduced, lacquered steel armor became almost a necessity to deal with Tanegashima rifles. And those types of bulletproof armor were called Tamashi Gusoku. Gusoku basically translating to modern armor. Now, I say all that, but if we're being fair, here he's only pointing to the 11th to 16th century. Let's leave out the Edo period, because that comes after the 16th century, and ask ourselves a question. Did armor evolve during that time?
Yes!
During the later 11th century up to the 12th century and the end of the Heian period, samurai armor was constructed of lamellar leather armor to protect it from deterioration in the humid climate of Japan. They would later also incorporate iron scaled armor as well for added protection. It wouldn't be until 1548, in the 16th century, that Japan would eventually have to deal with the Tanegashima rifles and the arrival of European influence. But if this proves anything, it proves that there is a definite change in the armor. They didn't just stop because they didn't need to.
They were on the other side of the world. Samurai and knights never met because of the geographic distance, while these knights and Vikings never met because the Vikings were all dead.
Again, they weren't really dead. See, some Nords and Danes ended up becoming knights themselves by converting to Christianity and becoming the Norman knights. Other Vikings just gave up warfare and started living more peaceful lives under the rulership of local lords and governors because, again, many were converting to Christianity and there was no more need to Viking anymore. Viking, in this case, being a verb. But leaving that aside, in the year 1171, Norman knights sieged the country of Ireland, which was controlled by the Danes, a culture from which the Vikings hailed, so it's not entirely true that the Nords and knights never truly fought each other. I think one of the big problems we have here is that he's confusing Vikings for a race or culture. Viking is an action. It basically translates to raiding, you know. The cultures that made up Vikings were Danes and Scandinavians, Nordics, basically your Nordic cultures. So Vikings didn't so much die as the need to Viking no longer needed to be done. So not really dead per se.
It should be noted that each class can get different armor and weapons from other time periods, such as knights getting Crusader armor, but overall, and mainly looking at the most generic class, these time periods seem accurate.
Butting in again, this is the main way this video differs from the game theorists. MatPat looked at knights and samurai from the 11th century, while in this video, we are looking at the warriors that are shown in For Honor, but with historical accuracy. In other words, his video is a history theory, mine is a game theory. It is a bit odd. But even if you only looked at the 11th century, MatPat's video is still inaccurate. We'll get to that later. Onwards with the original video. And this leads right into point one of why this is a weird thing to talk about. Knights versus samurai versus Vikings. This never happened in any combination.
Oh, no, you don't get to pull that card. Much like MatPat did, you're hiding behind the technicality of time period. Just because they aren't the type seen in For Honor, Vikings still fought knights. You can't say Vikings never fought knights. I'm sure you'll change it in a minute. I'm sure you'll say they never fought these knights. but for that one reason, I'll leave it aside. I'll let it slide this time, only because you're owning up to it, but let me make this clear. If you're going to say that Vikings never fought knights, you need to involve all knights. The Knicks are early knights. You can't ignore them. They're still knights, technically. May not be the For Honor knights, but still knights, technically. Don't hide behind the time period technicality.
Which vastly changes how the equipment and fighting styles correlate. So first, who did the Vikings actually fight? Weak, poor villages, other Vikings, maybe the occasional Anglo-Saxon guard, meaning just a dude in chainmail with a spear or a short sword.
The Vikings use scare tactics and shock troops, which are their really elite troops. They create fear in their enemies through shouts, fighting mercilessly, wearing an entire bear. Any of those alone would terrify the nearly defenseless villagers. They throw dirt in the eyes, aren't afraid of taking hostages, or killing literally everyone. Women, children, the occasional priest. And since most of these people are defenseless, the Vikings never had much of an advantage from wearing heavy armor, so they mostly chose not to, substituting for leather and hide, which protects against glancing blows, weak stabs from the children trying to defend their mother, and the cold. Can't forget about the cold. Having lighter armor means they can be faster and more dexterous, of course.
And while we don't know for sure, some historical theories claim that some Vikings would go into battle both drunk and high. Glorious. Increasing adrenaline and decreasing pain to the point of being almost non-existent. Until the next day. To those who were being attacked, this would make the Vikings seem magically strong. The term and battle class Berserker comes from Icelandic Vikings. They could go on a rampage. You could chop their arm off and it would just make them mad. Sure, they would still die in an hour due to blood loss, but they can still kill a few more people while bleeding out.
Ooh, boy, I'm kind of at a loss for words here. So how do I even begin to break this down? Okay, so Vikings only really fought innocent civilians, children, and priests. Except you totally skip over the fact that they did fight early knights. And even if you don't count them as knights, they're still warriors. But okay, we'll leave that aside. How about the Great Heathen War of 865, where Scandinavian and Danish forces invaded England? I guess the English Anglo-Saxons didn't have any competent warriors there, just a bunch of innocent women and children. The leather and fur armor thing. They probably didn't have that much leather, but fur is a possibility. They probably had cloth armor too, or gambeson armor, which was very strong armor and rather lightweight. In fact, Shadiversity talks about this specifically in his video, which is a really good video. I'll link it in the description, but he brings up how good gambeson is.
Even though there's no archaeological evidence for padded armors like gambeson, well, we wouldn't expect to find any archaeological evidence for these armors because they're organic material. They simply rot away and break down over a certain length of time. So even though that's the case, there are good chances that the Vikings had some type of padded armament for the less wealthy Vikings. Now, the misconceptions about gambeson armor and what people that play video games, role-playing games, I'm one of them, okay? I used to have this misconception as well. They would think of this as padded armor and then attribute its effectiveness to the effectiveness that video games and Dungeons & Dragons proclaim it to be, one of the lowest levels of armor, which is absolute bull, okay? Tests have been done on gambeson to show that depending on the layers of linen that are in these quilted garments, and if you wanted a gambeson that was properly defended, real thing, armor, it would have a lot of layers. And doing tests against these things, they can stop arrows, okay, from longbows. So not only is it likely that Vikings wore gambeson-like armor in the early medieval period, gambesons were used in the high medieval period as well, and even a bit later. Gambesons were just amazing, and they have been used by so many different cultures, not just Vikings, through so many different periods in history. Why? Because it was so effective!
But they also had chainmail. Some wealthy Nords and Vikings probably had chainmail. They didn't just run in with leather and fur all the time. But okay, let's pretend for a moment they didn't have chainmail. You think that gambeson and fur and leather is only good at protecting against glancing blows and child stabs? Gambeson and cloth armor could protect against arrows if necessary. They were actually really good armor. A lot of people overlook them. Gambeson was actually a very strong form of armor. Sure, not as good as plate mail, but still very useful. And then the cold thing. Vikings didn't just live in cold climates and temperatures. They inhabited temperate areas as well. Think about it. If you're only living in harsh winter conditions, then you can't cultivate crops and thus can't keep your lands alive. And finally, the drunk or high thing. Okay, so there is some historical precedent to believe some Vikings might have done this, and I do bring that up in the Berserker video. But they take it to an illogical end here. It doesn't matter how high you are. Getting your arm removed isn't going to just make you mad. If your arm is severed, the amount of blood loss is extreme, and your brain will send you into hypovolemic shock, which will cause your body to slip into unconsciousness so that it can slow blood flow and try to save your life. If a Viking was so high that his brain couldn't send him into that unconscious state, he would bleed out in minutes, especially if his heart rate was spiked due to the drugs. Being high on mushrooms might make you more pain tolerant, but not invincible.
So Vikings certainly seem like a force to be reckoned with, but since they never fought against these knights or samurai, we don't know for sure how they would do. So let's move on to the knights. Knights from this time period mainly fought other knights. Each country with its own troops would do all it can to best its own armor and weaponry. It was a full-on arms race. Every blacksmith constantly developing new alloys and new ways to make metal stronger and swords sharper and more powerful. War strategy was brought to a whole new level. Constantly, new armors were made to counter swords, eventually being fully cut and stab-proof. So, blacksmiths made maces, not to pierce armor, but to smash it in. So, blacksmiths made strong shields and hilts to block maces. So, other blacksmiths made flails to bend around shields and still hit the armor. And all of this was going on while siege weaponry was developed, and to counter that, masonry was further developed to counter it. Archery was also advanced, and shields and armor were further developed to better block arrows. Then came armor-piercing arrows. New fighting styles were also developed, each one to counter the other. As you may have gathered, people have a knack for figuring out better ways to kill each other while saving themselves.
And here's a fun fact. Knights, interestingly, did a lot of grabbing and holding an enemy down while the other soldier stabbed him. So knights were very advanced technologically speaking, but all that armor clearly has to be pretty dang heavy, right? Maybe that's enough to wear them out and lose.
So remember how MatPat limited the Vikings and Knights to just the 11th century but allowed the Samurai Edo period armor, which I agree was a really bad move? I sense the same problem here. Here, he's focusing only on what the knights had in the 15th century, which I wouldn't mind so much, because a lot of the knights in For Honor look like they came from the 15th century. Except he's now trying to explain the evolution of armor and weapons for the knights, and to understand that, you do have to go back before the 15th century. Early knights, which, again, he doesn't really count, wore gambeson, chainmail, and sometimes scaled armor. They carried heavy kite shields and spears, pikes, or arming swords. And as time progressed, there was indeed sort of an arms race as knights began developing stronger and more durable weapons and armor. But what I find funny here is he claims that the knights developed plate armor and then developed maces to break through armor, so shields had to be made. Now, firstly, shields existed well before the era of the knights. What he may mean here is that they developed stronger shields. And that's one thing, but that needs better phrasing. Secondly, it was actually the opposite. As armor got better, the need for shields decreased, so knights could switch to two-handed weapons, which could force enemies to fight from a distance, and would allow two-handed swings and strikes, which would have a better chance of bludgeoning armor, such as your common poleaxes, halberds, longswords, and lances. Maces and flails were still likely used, but it's harder to get in close with them and hit with those weapons when your enemy has a halberd to keep you at a distance. And finally, the armor thing. Why do people assume that knight plate mail is super heavy? I guess that's a pop culture thing. Plate mail armor is actually lighter armor than worn today, and it was distributed throughout the body through harnesses to make it lightweight and easier to use. There are lots of clips online of people using plate mail armor and doing gymnastics. You know, it's not nearly as cumbersome as people think it is.
But we still have the samurai to look at. Who did the samurai fight? Mainly other samurais, peasants, the Chinese a few times, and the Mongolians twice.
Yes, the Koreans were just a silly myth.
At the time, Japan was not super friendly with itself. Various city-states and villages would attack each other. So samurai were hired by townsfolk to protect their towns.
Okay, so samurai were not hired to protect towns. Samurai served feudal lords who were duty-bound to defend their lords and the lands that their lords owned. This whole idea of hiring a samurai, you might hire a ronin, you might hire a bushi, a warrior, but a samurai at the time period of For Honor, since we're playing that game, we're playing with the time periods here, since we're playing with the time period of For Honor samurai, which looks to be around Edo to Sengoku period, at that point in time, no. Samurai were vassals. They served the daimyo. You couldn't just hire one to come and save your town.
Most of the time was spent in leisure, practicing stances and horse archery. Their armor was mostly made of bamboo and lacquer wood.
Wood? Really? We're going back to the wood thing? Oh no.
Cut into scales and fashioned into lamellar. The richer and higher ranking samurai could even afford a few metal pieces of armor. What really makes them stand out, however, is how decorative their armor was. Very fancy stuff. And when the time came, they fought with a deep sense of honor and a Bushido code. Watching the samurai fight was like a dance-off to the death.
I'm not going to make any assumptions here, but these guys probably watch a lot of samurai movies and anime. Dance-like fighting isn't practical in real warfare. Watch these kendo fighters and tell me how like a dance this looks.
But while excellently trained in fighting stances with a blade, samurai were especially fluent in archery as well, and always carried their bow and arrows on their horses, which were never far away.
But is being honorable and pretty enough to win a war? They never fought knights or Vikings, or even many Western warriors at all, so we don't know for sure. But now that we have a brief overview of our three contenders, let's talk about why knights destroy the other two.
Okay, oddly enough, I actually agree that the knights are the winners in this three-way battle, but I'm willing to bet I'm not going to like his reasoning.
First off, let me just say that I am a huge weeb. I love anime and Japan and sweet, sharp katana warriors, so it pains me to say that the samurai honestly are garbage tier.
The samurai are garbage tier. Oh boy. I can't wait to hear this one.
But why? Well, let's go over that. Blacksmiths. Japanese blacksmiths. Easily the greatest blacksmiths known to the history of the world. Such perfection, such finesse. Why were they so great? Because they managed to take absolutely garbage materials and make fairly decent swords out of them. There's this stigma about katanas in general that they are the greatest swords of all time, and in modern times, yes, very much so. Modern katanas are full on the pinnacle of swordsmithery. But why? Because in modern times, they use ore from the West instead of sand. Japan is an island nation. It's fresh. They don't have any ore deposits. So while the rest of the world got to work with pure, huge chunks of iron ore, Japan had to filter it out of the sand. And using these primitive filters, you could never get it perfect. It's still hard to filter out the iron from sand. Iron sand is mainly oxidized iron, but it is also full of titanium, silica, manganese, calcium, and vanadium, all of which are not very good for swords. It makes them weak and brittle. Sure, ancient katanas are definitely sharp enough to sever flesh, but have fun fighting anyone with metal armor, or even just hitting another metal sword. Even folding 1,000 times doesn't get rid of the impurities, it just moves them around. And Japan couldn't buy much ore either. China was their closest neighbor, and they were like, no, we have millions of people! They all need swords too! And then they made them all spears because it uses less metal. This is why only the richest samurai had metal armor bits at all. It was very expensive in that part of the world. So here we have very honorable warriors fighting with brittle swords and wooden armor. They also happen to be best known for seppuku, which might come in handy here.
Granted, saying their armor is made of wood makes it sound weaker than it actually was. It was hardened wood and bamboo. The great thing about bamboo armor is that its shape makes it difficult to get one clean cut horizontally, limiting slashes to vertical. And even if it does get a cut, you have to soak it overnight, and the cut sort of heals itself. Also, strong silk cloth was often worn underneath, protecting against lighter stabs. But no amount of silk and bamboo can compare to full plate armor. A heavy sword or heavy axe can still cut through samurai armor with a good blow or two, but that's not happening to the knights. Katanas are light swords all about slashing and slicing power, exactly what knight armor is impenetrable to.
Okay, so this actually hurts. This hurts so much I don't know where to start. So, the sand thing. The way he phrases it makes it sound like they just went to the beach, picked up some sand, and just tried it out. If that's true, maybe Obi-Wan should have brought in a katana to fight Anakin. He would have won no problem.
It's over, Anakin! I have
The sand.
Okay, so let's talk about Japanese forging real quick. It's true that the steel used in making swords, known as tamahagane, came from iron sand. But the reason Japanese swords had impurities is not because of how bad the tamahagane is, it's because the Japanese forges couldn't reach the necessary temperatures to help eliminate the impurities. Ore from Europe also had impurities, but they could get their forges hot enough to get rid of these impurities, so they didn't have to fold it so much. To compensate for the fact that their forges couldn't get hot enough to get rid of the impurities, they had to fold the blade. The swordsmiths had to fold the blade many times to help harden the steel and make up for the impurities. This produced a durable sword, just not perfect. To get an idea of this, take 3 pieces of paper, right? Put them all on top of each other, and now try folding them all together like 5 or 6 times, and then try to rip that folded paper in half. Notice how hard it is at that point. It's a weak analogy, but it's a good enough analogy that you can kind of understand why folding steel really works. It makes up for the impurities. It doesn't get rid of them necessarily, it makes up for them. And by the end of the reheating and heat treatment, and after constant forging, the steel will be pretty pure, well, pure enough for the ancient world. Not this crap tier steel you keep describing. You keep claiming that all the folding does is move the impurities around, but that's not being totally genuine. And then the whole idea of taking and then that clip you showed of this dude taking a katana and slamming it into a longsword. First of all, katanas are not swords designed for that kind of clashing. Katanas were never really designed for that kind of clashing style maneuver. They're more designed for almost deflection and retaliation. You would never just want to slam, like, clapping your sword against the other, one after the other, in static clashes. That's not the way those kind of swords work. The curvature of the sword, the way it was held, the way it was used, usually you'd want to, deflect, or if you had to do a static block, do it only once or twice and then get in a quick strike. You very rarely want to just clash with a sword like that. But yeah, that gives a different idea of how that worked. European swords didn't need to be folded as much because they could get rid of more of the impurities. Also, considering that katana swords did clash with other swords and had to be met with steel armor on occasion, it's highly unlikely that a katana would break after just a single clash. You do realize that if a katana sword could break that easily, they probably would have faded it out of use. While it's true that the katana was largely ineffective against steel armor, that's the reason it was more of a backup weapon rather than the main battlefield weapon. Because the katana was a last resort weapon on the battlefield. You'd rather use something like a yari spear or a naginata or a kanabo, or some kind of weapon that could deal more damage from a distance and could deal with those armors. I love how other weapons are practically left out in this video, though. You leave out the yari, the naginata, the kanabo, the nodachi. How about war axes? Some samurai did use war axes. None of those get a mention? Oh, and speaking of armor, okay, time to do it. Wooden armor was never worn by the samurai. By the age of the samurai, leather and iron lamellar armor were in common use, like the domaru, which was constructed in the Heian period and was the favorite armor for a while, fading out the more expensive and box-like oyori armors, which were also not wooden. In fact, wooden armor was faded out of Japanese use by the time of the samurai. The domaru was made up of leather and metal scales woven into place by silk, not wood. And by the 16th century, the period of history you conveniently cut off at, with the addition of firearms, Japanese armor evolved again from domaru to gusoku, which was made up of steel plate armor sometimes, and was much more protective and easier to manufacture, as well as being lacquer to ensure longevity in the humidity of the climate. Samurai did not ever use wooden armor. And what's up with that thing about bamboo armor fixing itself with water? I tried looking that up too. I tried looking that up to see how true that was, and all I could find outside of like Dungeons and Dragons forums was how the Chinese might have had that at one point. I'd love to see the source. No, I'm not even joking. I really do want to see the source. Where did you look up that the samurai wore bamboo armor? Where did that come from?
But how about the Vikings versus Knights then? Boy, do I like fighting big mans with full plate armor whilst I am wearing the leather and having my chest exposed. At least I have this dull 9th century iron axe to fight their 13th century steel armor. Oh, I'm going to need more mead. What was that accent? I have no clue. But the only major counter that Vikings have against knights is their trusty shield. The classic shield bash could knock a knight out cold, but using your shield as a weapon leaves you open.
The Viking shields were some of the best shields in history because of the unique way they were held and used in combat.
But what I personally like about the round shield having a center grip, it makes it pretty versatile. So you can do some things that you can't do with a strapped shield. For example, you can more effectively strike with it. You can redirect attacks. So if an attack comes in, you let it roll over to this side, and now you've created an opening on the opposite side and can strike that.
But speaking of that shield, why would they carry a shield into battle? Didn't you say earlier that Vikings never really had any need for armor or heavy armor because all they fought were children and women and innocent priests? They never really fought any competent warriors? Why even bring a shield if they're never going to fight any competent warriors? Are you saying there might have been a use for it? It's not like Viking shield walls were a thing. That never happened in history.
Plus, Viking swords were eventually developed into the swords knights use, and knight armor was made to be uncuttable from them, even at their more advanced state.
So, mind if I point out that you said only wealthy samurai could get steel plate armor? The same goes for knights, Only wealthy knights could get full plate mail because that's expensive too. Other knights who couldn't afford it probably had gambeson and chainmail. And want to guess how effective that is against a Dane axe? Speaking of which, considering the size and weight of a Dane axe, that would still do some tremendous damage from bludgeoning strikes alone. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to weapons, don't just talk about how well they can cut, talk about the weight behind them. A Dane axe weighs a lot, and if you swing it full force at someone, even who's wearing armor, that's going to knock the wind out of you, that could break a bone, that could do a lot of damage. It doesn't just have to cut. sometimes you got to look beyond just the cutting technique. That was one of my problems with the TV show Deadliest Warrior. They often just tested it and they said, oh, well, this weapon couldn't cut through the armor, so it's useless. Yeah, but consider for a moment, what if it knocked them on the ground? What if they could dodge it? What if it could knock the wind out of them? Like, there are lots of factors besides just how much can it make you bleed. There's always more to it than just how much does it cut you and make you bleed.
The main way a Viking's axe would prove useful is when fighting dirty, reaching around the leg and tripping the knight, leaving him open for a tactical strike. But this is also challenging as most Vikings had very little combat training. Most Vikings had very little combat training.
Okay, time out. Whoa, stop. Are you seriously saying Vikings were not trained warriors? Really?
Okay, fine. I'm cool. I'm fine.
Okay, so the Nordic Viking warriors were exceptionally trained and skilled. That's why the Byzantines hired them as the Varangian Guard. That's why they were knighted as the Normans, because the Europeans and Anglo-Saxons looked at them and said, ooh, y'all are actually pretty good. That's why they could form an army called the Great Heathen Army and invade England. These guys were not just brute force idiots. They weren't some idiots who picked up an axe one day and said, yarg, I think I'll go hit someone with this. Of course, Vikings had combat training. They trained with each other. They trained amongst their own kind. They fought their own people. They fought other Nords. They were totally trained warriors. Guys, debunking videos are like a highway. Highways of catastrophe, and unfortunately this highway needs a pit stop. Sorry guys, I'm gonna need to take a break. I'm about halfway through the video, maybe a little more than halfway, but I need a bit of a break. This has been a real sludge fest. I'm really trying to work my way through this. Hope you guys enjoyed. I will come back later and talk about the rest of this later. I hope y'all enjoyed. Please let me know what you think down in the comments section, and we will wrap this up later. See you in part 2. Take care, guys.